Hello students, this is Dr. Martina Hesser. Today we're talking about Italy and Spain in the 17th century. This is part 3 of our lecture series. And we will start with Francisco de Zurbarán, who was a Spanish painter who was very much influenced by Caravaggio. And we will talk about how this comes about a little bit later in the lecture today. He copied paintings of Caravaggio at a very young age and painted directly from nature. He made great use of the lay figure in the study of draperies, in which he was particularly proficient. He had a special gift for white draperies, as we can see here in this Saint Serapion here from 1628. His subjects were mostly severe and ascetic religious figures. His style is more reserved and chastened than that of Caravaggio. The tone of color is sometimes quite bluish, maybe not in this piece, but otherwise. Exceptional effects are attained by the precisely finished foregrounds and masked out largely in light and shade. Sometimes the figures are pulled all the way to the front of the picture plane, as we see here in the Saint Serapion figure. At around 1630, he was appointed painter of Philip IV and moved to Madrid. Even though he had this important position, he died in poverty and obscurity, and that probably has largely to do with a painter who comes from Seville and who we will discuss right after Zurbarán. He paints a lot of martyrs and saints, as we see here, and in this case it is Saint Serapion. We know that the figure of Saint Serapion was tortured and killed in 1196 during the Third Crusade, and here especially beaten by the Moors. It is quiet and contemplative and shows the saint as he is shackled to chains and hanging down, and his face is severely deformed from the beatings. But his clothing shows no dirt and no blood stains. Also, the face does not show any bruising. So that is quite unusual. He almost looks like a figure of Jesus here, with his arms spread out as if he were nailed to the cross, and that is probably the analogy that he wanted to achieve with the placement and the composition of this figure. Now let's talk about Diego Velázquez, and he is the painter that I mentioned before. Diego Velázquez was a Spanish painter who was the leading artist in the court of King Philip IV in Spain. He was an individualistic artist of the Baroque period, important as a portrait artist and a personal friend of Philip IV. He painted numerous renditions of scenes of historical and cultural significance. He also painted scores of portraits for the Spanish royal family, other notable European figures, and commoners. He was born in Seville in Andalusia and later went to Madrid, where he made a name for himself as a painter. In 1629, he went to Italy. He later became court painter of Philip IV and even chamberlain of the palace. The subject of this painting is a water cellar. This was a common profession for the lower classes in Seville during Velázquez's time. The cellar has two customers, a young boy and a young man in the background shadows. In the foreground sits the cellar's gigantic pots of water, glistening with streams of running water on the outside. They are large and rounded, and almost protrude out of the painting into the viewer's space. The sailor hands a freshly poured glass to the boy. In it is a fig, which was put in there to make the water taste fresher. This calm scene is remarkable for the depiction of the sailor himself. His pensive face is battered by its direct exposure to sunlight. He has a face that is deeply scarred with the wrinkles of age, which speaks of long years of experience. His short hair and old plain clothes give him the appearance of a monk, or a saint, or an eccentric philosopher maybe. His gaze is empty, which indicates deep thought. He is almost unaware of those around him. Velázquez was very skilled in depicting high subject matter such as biblical stories. He focuses his attention on a member of the lower classes here and shows that putting poverty center stage can make a profound impression on viewers. This type of depiction was often seen in Caravaggio's work. I should mention that Caravaggio's influence was felt most intensely in Naples, where he had spent 9 months while fleeing from authorities in Rome. Naples, therefore, has a great love of his style of painting, and for the next two centuries or so, many artists from Naples imitate his style. Naples was under the rule of the Spanish crown at that time, and the Spanish viceroy sent many of the new Tenebroso pictures back to Spain. There they created somewhat of a sensation, and also a large following by Spanish artists. But not only the Tenebroso style was adopted, also his naturalism. Caravaggio went against the idealistic trends of mannerism and the Renaissance, painting saints and divine beings as fallible cripples and prostitutes. Velázquez was not as aggressively provocative as Caravaggio, but he also does not idealize his subjects. Rather, he aims to represent it in a way that is precisely faithful to life. He captures the imperfection of the sailors' pots, the saturations of dampness on their sides, the glistening of the light on the small drops of water in the glass, and the realistic expression of the characters. Today there are 3 versions of this painting known. One is in England, another one in Florence, and the third one in the United States. Diego Velázquez made lots and lots of portraits of the Spanish royal family, like this here, a portrait of Philip IV of Spain from around 1631 or 1632. Or this one here of Philip's wife, Queen Mariana of Austria, and this is a later one that was done in 1652. Now let's talk about Philip IV of Spain. Here he is once more. Early in his life he had a few years of inconclusive successes, but soon his reign was characterized by political and military decay. Philip has been held responsible for the decline of Spain, which was mostly due, however, to organic issues largely beyond his control, or the control of any ruler. Philip certainly possessed more energy, both mentally and physically, than his diffident father. He was a fine horseman and a keen hunter. He ascended to the throne at age 16. Probably because of his youth, he let a powerful courtier, the Duke of Olivares, take over the business of government. Philip seemed to have lacked the confidence to free himself from Olivares' influence once he did become of age. With Duke of Olivares' encouragement, he rather busied himself with frivolous amusements. By 1643, when disaster falling on all sides led to the dismissal of the all-powerful minister, Philip had largely lost the power to devote himself to the hard work of government. After a brief struggle with the task of directing the administration of the most extensive and worst organized multinational state in Europe, he sank back into indolence and let other favorites govern. His court was grossly corrupt. Victorian historians prudishly attributed the early death of his eldest son, Baltasar Carlos, he dies at age 16, to debauchery encouraged by the gentleman entrusted by the king with the prince's education. He had at least 7 children with his first wife. Her name was Elizabeth of Bourbon, and 5 with his second wife, Marianna of Austria, and 1 illegitimate child. You can see that Philip IV of Spain is not exactly a handsome guy. He has all the features of the Habsburg princes that come about through centuries of inbreeding. Now here's a close-up of this individual here. And we have to imagine that there is a painter at work who knows how to please a patron and would make a great effort to make him look good. So despite all these efforts, we can see that Philip IV had the very pronounced Habsburg lip and the pronounced Habsburg chin, which comes from too much inbreeding, and also the droopy eyelids, which will become even more pronounced a generation later with his son Charles. So here's a good court painter at work who's doing his best to make his patron look nice. We mentioned Prince Balthasar Carlos before as the young prince, the first son of the king, who had died at a very young age. And here we see a portrait of him from 1636, also made by Diego Velázquez. Velázquez painted the first group of many portraits of the young prince and heir to the Spanish throne, Don Balthasar Carlos, looking dignified and lordly even in his childhood. He's shown in the dress of a field marshal here on a horse that is galloping through the countryside. Don Balthasar Carlos died in 1646 at the age of 17. So judging by this portrait, he must have been about, 2-3 years old. Losing a son at the age of 16 must have been a terrible blow for the Spanish royal family. And the reason for that was that probably earlier, when children were first born, they were handed over to a large staff of keepers and educators who were in charge of raising this little individual. And the parents most of the time tried not to make a close emotional connection with their children at a very young age because infant mortality was just so high, and you did not want to build your hopes up that high and then later on end up losing this precious child. So usually by the time when children reach the age of 5 or 6 years old, the parents were getting ready to think that maybe there is one individual that will survive infancy, and they were willing to make a closer emotional connection with this individual. So to lose a child at age 16, especially the crown prince and heir to the throne, must have been awful. Now let's look at another portrait of another little prince that was done in 1659, and here we see Infante Felipe Prospero at the age of maybe 3 or 4 years old. Philip Prospero of Spain was the first male child of the marriage between Philip IV and Marianna of Austria to survive infancy. Spain had had no heir since the death of Prince Balthasar Carlos, the son of Philip and his first wife and queen, Isabella, 11 years before. Philip Prospero lived for only 4 years. We don't know what caused his death. This quote from a contemporary tells us about his constitution. Quote, "He was almost always ill and had frequent attacks of epilepsy." End of quote. And epilepsy is also closely linked to inbreeding. So there might have been a cause for the early demise of this little prince. In the painting, the prince appears to be around 3 years old. He stands before a rich black background. His wrist limply rests over the back of a child-sized chair in which lies an equally limp spaniel. The painting directly admits the little boy's precarious health. From strings crisscrossing his chest and waist hang metal bells and at least 2 protective lucky amulets, a cornicello, and on the string across his left shoulder a black object like a fig hand carved out of jet. Immediately we ask ourselves why this little heir to the powerful Spanish throne died so young. And what about the outfit he is wearing? Children who were not yet clean would all wear a dress like this little prince here. They would do their business in a corner of the palace, and a servant would usually come and take care and clean up after them. These little princes would have their own entourage of people in charge of them, a monk or a nun for spiritual guidance, ladies in waiting to cater to every whim. And Felipe Prospero was probably getting lost in the huge royal palace and therefore had these little bells installed on his garment so he could be more easily recovered. This fact alone tells us that there must have been a fair share of neglect in children, even in children of the royal family. Now, this was Philip IV's favorite daughter, and her name was Margarita Teresa of Austria. Also a beautiful portrait of her here by Diego Velázquez. Margarita Teresa was the favorite child of her father, who referred to her as my joy in his private letters. Now imagine, if you are the favorite daughter of the King of Spain, he will try to find a fortuitous match for you early on in your life. In this case, that means that the king tried to find a spouse who was of even more elevated social standing than he himself was. There is only one person who would outrank the King of Spain at that time, and that was the Holy Roman Emperor. Therefore, as a child, Margarita Teresa was betrothed to her maternal uncle and paternal cousin. And this was Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Her father stipulated that she should maintain her position in the line of succession to the Spanish throne and would pass her succession rights on to her descendants, something Leopold I gladly accepted. In the summer of 1666, after her father's death, the only 15-year-old princess left her native Spain and traveled to Austria, where she married Leopold I. Despite the difference in their ages, some 11 years, they were very happy together. They shared a number of interests, especially theater and music. She called him uncle. Even after they were married, he called her Gretel, a German nickname for Margaret. After giving birth to 4 children and weakened by many miscarriages, Margarita Teresa died at the young age of 21. Imagine, this was the life you could expect to have even as the favorite daughter of a king, life expectancy of 21. Now, let's talk about a large piece of history painting that Diego Velázquez makes in his capacity as the Spanish court artist. This is the Surrender of Breda from June the 2nd of 1625. The painting was done 10 years later in 1635. The Surrender of Breda was inspired by Velázquez's first visit to Italy, in which he accompanied Ambrogio Spinola, who conquered the Dutch city of Breda a few years before. This masterwork depicts a transfer of the key to the city from the Dutch to the Spanish army during the siege of Breda. It is considered one of the best Velázquez paintings. Now let's talk about Diego Velázquez's most important painting, which is called Las Meninas from 1656, which we see right here. Diego Velázquez paints a royal portrait that goes far beyond the scope of an ordinary portrait here. Central protagonist is the Infanta Margarita Teresa, shown with her own entourage, her favorite ladies-in-waiting, some dwarfs and pets, a nun and a monk in the background. Despite the extensive history of inbreeding between Austrian and Spanish Habsburg family branches, Margarita exhibited little or none of the mental and physical defects inherited by her brother and other relatives. She was the favorite child of her father and was roaming the royal palace freely. She is shown as she comes into a stately room that used to be her brother's quarters. After his death, Philip IV asked his friend and confidant Velázquez to move into these rooms. When he moved into the palace, Velázquez brought with him his substantial art collection. In the back we see two paintings by Rubens that were part of his collection and that are now in the Prado collection in Madrid. We see the highly concentrated Velázquez working by a large canvas, but he is clearly not the person of interest for the little princess. She is looking at the same people Diego paints on his monumental canvas, her parents. We see reflections of Philip IV and his wife, Queen Mariana, in the mirror in the back. In doing this, the painting plays a trick on us. It makes the viewer switch roles with the King of Spain. The audience starts to play a role and is the center of attention here. All the eyes are on the king and queen. Here is a close-up of Diego Velázquez as he's painting in a very concentrated manner. Here is a close-up of Margarita Teresa, the beautiful little princess. She's about 5 years old at that time. And here are the king and queen, or their reflections rather, in the back of the mirror. We know that this painting had a place of honor in the king's quarters and was always good to act as a conversation starter for visitors. We see a bodyguard in the back who is watching out for the safety of the royal family here. The reason why Velázquez came up with a wonderful artwork was rooted in his own vanity. For the longest time, he wanted to become a member of the Order of Santiago. This was a religious lay brotherhood where only members of the aristocracy could join, and Velázquez wanted to do just that. Social climber that he was, he wanted to achieve this last great goal while he was still working for Philip IV. After the king saw this painting, he reportedly took up the brush and painted a red cross on Velázquez's jacket. This was the sign of the membership in this order. Velázquez was granted his knighthood and had finally arrived in the lofty echelons of aristocracy. Thank you.